Hello, this is Dr. Ross, and this is the video lecture, The Ears and Their Senses. In this video lecture, I'm going to be discussing some anatomical features of the ears, as well as the physiology of how we hear, which is also called audition, and I will also discuss equilibrium as well. So let's do a basic introduction here. So hearing and equilibrium are going to be covered together in this lecture because these senses are both provided by the ear. They're actually both provided by the internal ear, to be exact. So of course, equilibrium will inform us of the position of our head in space by monitoring things such as gravity, linear acceleration, and rotation. And then hearing will enable us to detect as well as interpret sound waves. So the signals generated about equilibrium are sent to the brainstem, while hearing signals created from hearing are going to be sent to the brainstem and or the auditory cortex. So let's get started by talking about the anatomical regions of the ear. So the ear itself is divided into three anatomical regions. The external ear, which is shown in this image in blue, is the visible portion of the ear. It basically collects and directs sound waves toward the middle ear, which is shown, that portion of the ear in this diagram is shown in sort of this mauve color. The middle ear, in general, collects sound waves and then transmits them to the internal ear. And then the internal ear, shown in yellow, contains the sensory organs, as I mentioned in the previous slide, for both hearing and equilibrium. So I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about each of these regions in the next few slides. So starting with the external ear, this is going to include everything outside of the eardrum, essentially. It's going to include the auricle, which is what we would most often associate with our ear. This is going to be a fleshy, cartilaginous piece. And this is called the auricle, or sometimes the pinna. The auricle basically protects the opening of the canal and provides directional sensitivity. So sounds coming from behind the head are often blocked by the auricle, but sounds coming from the side or front are going to be collected and channeled into the external acoustic meatus. Now recall, this was the hole that we looked at when we looked at the bones of the skull. So the external acoustic meatus is basically the sound passageway. It also contains a bunch of ceruminous glands. These secrete that earwax, which is called cerumen, and this is going to help keep out foreign objects or small insects. It also protects from debris and infection. In addition, in the auditory or external auditory canal, there are these outward-facing hairs, and those are there to trap debris as well and increase tactile sensitivity. So if something moves across those hairs, you're going to notice that sensation. Okay. So the tympanic membrane is at the end of the auditory canal, and it's also the end of the external ear. You may be more familiar with the layman's term for this, which is the eardrum. So this is basically a thin, transparent sheet, and again, it separates the external ear from the middle ear. It's very, very delicate. And so the auricle itself, as well as the external auditory canal, are going to provide some protection to keep there from being, mechanical injury. All right. So moving on to the middle ear. The middle ear is going to lie between the tympanic membrane of the outer ear and what's called the oval window of the inner ear. The main function of the middle ear is to transmit the vibrations from the tympanic membrane to that oval window, which is going to communicate with the inner ear. So the middle ear can sometimes be referred to as the tympanic cavity. So this cavity this cavity is hollow and filled with air. Now, this is what causes those feelings of discomfort when you have pressure changes. So, because of pressure differences that can arise between this cavity and the environment, when you're at high altitudes or diving in water, you'll feel that pain sensation. Next is the auditory tube. This is also referred to as the eustachian tube. Basically, this helps regulate pressure in that tympanic cavity. And it's located right here in this diagram. And so basically it's pinched off so that it doesn't get plugged with a bunch of mucus, but it can be open when you move your jaw. So this is why yawning or chewing can help relieve that intense pressure that you feel in your ears when you're on board an aircraft, for example. The auditory tube also drains fluid from the ear, and it can also allow microorganisms to travel from the nasopharynx into the middle ear. So this is often a source of ear infections. So the middle ear, probably the most important aspect of the middle ear are these three bones that it contains called auditory ossicles. Okay, and that's what we refer to those three bones as collectively. The ossicles themselves deliver sound energy from the tympanic membrane to that oval window of the inner ear. The bones are called the malleus, which resembles a hammer and is Latin for hammer, the incus, which is Latin for anvil, and the stapes, which is Latin for stirrup. And it kind of looks like that. You can even see, even with the small stapes in this image, that it sort of looks like where you would put your foot on a stirrup. Okay, and so these three bones together are the auditory ossicles. Okay, so I want to talk about the ossicles and how they transmit sound briefly before I move on. So, as I mentioned, the ossicles transmit sound from the tympanic membrane, again in the outer ear, to that oval window of the inner ear. And so what I want to do is show you a quick animation of how the movement of the tympanic membrane, how that movement is transferred to the ossicles, and then how they transmit that movement to the oval window. So you can see that here. So you can see I don't know if the tympanic membrane is moving that much in that video, but the membrane moves the ossicles, and then they push on that auditory window. So if the sound waves were to travel directly to the oval window where they're transferred to a liquid environment, much of that energy would be lost, okay? So having the ossicles maximizes that energy transfer between the tympanic membrane and the oval window. The ossicles also serve to concentrate the pressure from the larger tympanic membrane to the much smaller oval window. So ultimately, these structures amplify the sound about 20 times, which is quite impressive. So another thing I want to mention is this muscle. So when we are exposed to very loud noises, there are two small muscles in the middle ear that will protect the tympanic membrane and ossicles from violent, abrupt movements. And so right here, what you can see is the tensor tympani muscle. This muscle contracts in response to loud sounds. And when it does that, it stiffens the ossicles. They don't move as freely. And so what that does is it reduces the intensity with which they push on that oval window, thereby dampening the transmission of sound to the inner ear. And this is referred to as the acoustic reflex. Okay, moving on to the internal ear. The internal ear is a winding passageway called a labyrinth, which is just a fun way of saying it's a network of canals. And they are formed by a layer of dense bone, so they are known as the bony labyrinth. And that is that piece that I have just indicated right here. The walls of the bony labyrinth are continuous with that surrounding temporal bone. We can subdivide the bony labyrinth into three areas. We've got the cochlea, shown here, which is a spiral-shaped bony chamber. It contains the cochlear duct, which is part of the membranous labyrinth, which is inside the bony labyrinth. We'll talk about that later. Receptors in this area are going to provide the sense of hearing. Next, we have the vestibule. This consists of a pair of membranous sacs. Those are inside the vestibule, so you can't see them in this image. And these have receptors in them that contribute that provide equilibrium sensations. We also have the semicircular canals up at the top of this image. These canals enclose semicircular ducts. Again, we can't see them in this image. And these ducts are continuous with the fluid-filled chambers in the vestibule. And they are also going to contribute to equilibrium. The last thing I want to mention is the vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve 8. Okay, so this nerve is going to be involved in balance and hearing. It's comprised of two parts, the vestibular fibers and the cochlear fibers. Both of them are purely sensory in function. The vestibular branch provides the sensory information for balance, and the cochlear branch is going to provide the sensory information for hearing. All right, so before I move on, I just want to kind of point out some features of the membranous labyrinth since you couldn't really see it on the previous slide. So the bony labyrinth in this image is shown in tan, and the membranous labyrinth is this pink-purple structure that's located inside. It's considerably smaller. The membranous labyrinth is considerably smaller than the bony labyrinth, and so it's kind of partly separated from it. And so between the membranous labyrinth and the bony labyrinth is a fluid called the perilymph. The membranous labyrinth contains a fluid called endolymph. It also is made up by those sacs I told you about in the previous slide, the utricle and the saccule. And it also contains the cochlear duct, and this is part of the membranous labyrinth that is inside of the cochlea. The semicircular ducts also contain canals as well. They're called semicircular canals. And so all of these, the cochlear duct, the utricle, the saccule, as well as the semicircular canals, these are all going to be continuous. Okay. Okay, so let's take a closer look at this membranous labyrinth inside of the cochlea. What we're looking at here is a cross-section that's just cutting through the cochlea, and it's revealing what is a three-chamber system. Okay, and I've labeled them 1, 2, 3. So these are the three chambers that we're looking at. The top chamber is the scala vestibule, and the bottom is the scala tympani. These chambers are the ones that contain the perilymph. Chamber 2 is basically the cochlear, well, it is the cochlear duct. Okay. So basically, and this is the one that's going to contain the endolymph. So the oval window that I've referred to is situated at the base of the scala vestibule. And the round window is situated at the base of the scala tympani. And movement of fluid due to the movement of these windows causes movement of the vestibular membrane. Okay, the vestibular membrane is located between the first two chambers, and it vibrates. And this ultimately is what's going to transmit the waves that create sound. The middle chamber, again marked with the 2, is the cochlear duct, and like I said, it's filled with the endolymph, and so it's part of the membranous labyrinth, and it is going to, the endolymph in there is going to move as a result of movement of that vestibular membrane, and that's going to affect what's called the spiral organ, which I'm going to discuss in more detail in a minute. The spiral organ is what actually senses the sound wave vibrations and basically converts them into action potentials. And this is going to be located between the cochlear duct, or that middle chamber, and the scala tympani. Okay, so what I want to talk about last is the spiral organ, or at least last in terms of anatomy. The spiral organ is also referred to as the organ of Corti, so if you're seeing that in your text, don't be alarmed. Basically, this is just a mixture of cell types, and this spiral organ serves as the receptor organ for hearing. So it contains a tectorial membrane as well as a basilar membrane, and these are going to sense the mechanical forces. I'm sorry, in the inner hair cells, which are going to sense the mechanical forces. The hair cells are located between this tectorial membrane and basilar membrane. So when these membranes move, it's going to be detected by the hair cells. So these outer hair cells are connected to the afferent fibers, and the inner hair cells are connected to the efferent fibers. And so as you can see, projecting from these hair cells are these small projections called stereocilia. So what happens is the movement of that vestibular membrane is going to displace the endolymph, and that's going to cause movement of the tectorial membrane. This movement is ultimately going to cause bending of the stereocilia, which will produce, ultimately will end up in producing an action potential that's going to move down the axon of a neuron in the cochlear branch, cranial nerve 8. Okay, so now what I want to do is put all this anatomical as well as physiological information together and try to communicate it to you in order. So first what we have are sound waves that are going to travel through the external acoustic meatus, and this is going to in turn cause movement of the tympanic membrane. The movement of the tympanic membrane will cause movement of the auditory ossicles, the malleus, incus, and stapes. And ultimately, the stapes is going to press on the oval window. And this is going to cause fluid displacement. This fluid displacement will cause movement of the vestibular membrane. And movement of this membrane is going to cause movement of the endolymph. Movement of the endolymph will shift movement of the endolymph will shift the tectorial membrane and the basilar membrane, and this will cause the stereocilia on the hair cells to bend. Ultimately, this will generate an axon potential that will travel down the axon of a neuron located within the cochlear nerve. Now, within the cochlea, the movement of that basilar membrane will displace paralymph in the scala tympani, which is that lower chamber. Okay, and then this is going to cause outward movement of that round window that's located just below the oval window. Okay, and ultimately, this is a very generalized overview of how the sound waves are transmitted and ultimately turned into an action potential. All right, so for the remainder of this talk, I want to discuss equilibrium. So along with hearing, the inner ear is responsible for encoding information about equilibrium, which is our sense of balance ultimately. And it does this in the vestibule and in the semicircular canals. So similar to the cochlea, the vestibule and semicircular canals use hair cells with stereocilia to detect movement of a fluid. So this is very similar to what we just went through. So there's several types of sensory receptors, and they provide information to the brain for maintenance of equilibrium. So it's not just the movement of this fluid. The eyes are going to be involved. So vision, proprioceptors in joints and tendons and muscles are also important for informing the brain about equilibrium as well. However, we're just discussing, what goes on in the inner ear for the remainder of this lecture. So there's two types of equilibrium. There's static gravitational equilibrium, and this involves the movement of the head with respect to gravity. And then there's dynamic or rotational equilibrium, and this involves acceleration of the head in rotation, horizontal and vertical movements. So different parts of these structures are going to be involved in those two types of equilibrium sensations. So first I want to start with static equilibrium. So the information for static equilibrium as well as linear acceleration comes from the utricle and the saccule, okay? And so these, of course, are located within the vestibule. The saccule and utricle each contain a sense organ called the macula, where stereocilia and their supporting cells are found, okay? Oops. Okay. The organs can respond to changes in position and acceleration because the tips of the stereocilia project into this dense otolithic membrane shown here, made up of a mixture of granules. These granules are basically calcium and proteins, and they're called otoliths. When the head moves, gravity causes the stones to move. And the movement of the stones within that membrane causes the stereocilia to bend. Ultimately, just like with hearing, this initiates an action potential in the vestibular nerve fibers that innervate them. And so then the bundles of stereocilia, in this case, are going to be arranged in various directions so that any direction of inclination will cause bending in different ways of those stereocilia, and that allows us to sense those changes in static equilibrium. Okay, so dynamic equilibrium utilizes the semicircular canals, which are those three ring-like extensions from the vestibule. So one ring is going to be oriented in the horizontal plane, and the other two are in the vertical plane. At the base of each of these semicircular canals, where it meets the vestibule, is this enlarged region called the ampulla. And this ampulla contains what's called the crista ampullaris. All right, and within that crystal ampullaris are these hair cells, just like in the cochlea, and they're located inside of a structure called the cupula. Okay, so the hair cells are inside that cupula, and that's basically a membrane that contains endolymph, and it's attached to the top of that ampulla. So when the head rotates in a plane parallel to the semicircular canal, the fluid in that canal does not move as quickly as the head is moving. As a result, this pushes the cupula to the opposite direction, okay? And so what that does is it deflects the stereocilia and it creates a nerve impulse. And so this is what's going to provide our brain with information about dynamic equilibrium. So at the end of the day, both hearing and equilibrium are going to be facilitated by stereocilia that are attached to hair cells. And it's the movement of that stereocilia that are going to initiate what's going to end up as an action potential that travels to the appropriate part of the brain and provides information. And that's it for this lecture on the ear and their senses.